Shalom from Jerusalem. This is Israel Update on TV7 News Israel. And I'm Amir Oren, sitting in for Jonathan Hessen, who is traveling. And we have a special guest today, retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, formerly of the U.S. Army and then the Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. General Kimmett, welcome.
Yeah, good morning.
And there are two issues today, but they converge on one location and one person. The location is the White House, Washington, D.C., and the person is Donald J. Trump, President of the U.S., in whose mind the entire decision-making process seems to be encompassed. And for General Kimmett, there are two issues, Iran and Gaza. And before we go into either of them, you have your pick. What would you like to start with?
I'd like to start with Greenland, but if that's not one of the significant issues, why don't we move on first to Gaza?
So obviously, Greenland, Venezuela, and other hotspots, or cold spots, as Greenland may be, are obviously affecting the priorities and decisions in Washington. But because this is January 15th, the Ides of January, and President Trump has long ago decided that in mid-January, the second phase of the Gaza plan will come into effect. Here we are. General.
Yeah, and here we are. Obviously, Steve Witkoff, who seems to be like Marco Rubio, the two people that solve all the world's problems for Donald Trump, seems to be on it. But I think we need to define what on it means. I think at this point, there are rhetorical suggestions that phase two is moving forward, and there's plenty of happy talk about it, but I think the two issues for me remain the international security force and disarmament of Hamas. I think both of those are unlikely, but it's probably a good sign that they're at least pushing forward to see if they can make progress in those two areas.
Do you foresee a symbolic gesture, Hamas coming forward with rockets, or perhaps AK-47s, giving them up and then saying, yes, we are in the process of disarmament?
Well, look, I've seen these DDR, the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs around the world, up to and including what is now called Northern Macedonia. You're right. Typically what happens is there is a symbolic handing in of a few often non-functioning weapons and great ceremonies surrounding that. A lot of flag waving, a lot of cheering, a lot of media, a lot of backslapping. But I think functionally everyone understands that that is more for drama than it is for effect.
Now, President Trump has committed the United States to get all of the hostages returned to Israel, those who were alive and the deceased ones. And there is now one police sergeant, Ran Gvili, who is still in Hamas captivity, or perhaps Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and they are refusing to return his remains. What are Israel and the United States to do?
It's quite obvious what they can do. What they should do are two different things. I think what Israel and the United States can do is recognize that Hamas understands the bond that Israel has with those being held hostage, determined to get back at any cost. Hamas realizes that and still uses it for leverage. And I think that would continue to rankle on any discussions of truly moving forward. On the other hand, there could be a more pragmatic view taken by Israel and say, okay, we finished that chapter. We hope one day these remains will be returned, but we are not going to let it hold up the next steps, which are critically important, which is the disarmament of Hamas and the international security force. Now, having said that, in many ways, that then puts the wild card in front of Hamas, which is you were determined to hold on to those remains if you even have them. You were determined to hold on to them as leverage to prevent your demobilization and your disarmament. But now here's our wild card. We will change our policy. We will accept the fact that his remains will be kept by Hamas, understanding that it's far more important for Hamas to disarm and then see what Hamas does. That's the pragmatic way, but I'm not sure that that's embraces the philosophy of the state of Israel. So, as somebody in Washington, D.C., who has a different view on this, I think the United States will follow the views and the policy of Israel.
But this also allows Israel to remain on the so-called yellow line rather
Yeah.
than withdraw from it to the international border. So maybe it's not so bad from the Israeli point of view, except, of course, for the Gavili family.
Yeah, and it also is not bad from Hamas's point of view because that gives them a reason and a shield to hide behind to prevent the disarmament. But again, that's a policy issue exclusive to the state of Israel, and I don't think the Americans should necessarily push too hard on trying to make an exceptional policy change to push the Gaza program forward.
Now, President Trump obviously has a way with words. He has changed the Department of Defense to the Department of War, but he has also created, at least verbally, the so-called Board of Peace, with himself as chairman. Regarding Gaza, there is another political echelon, another layer below him, with former Prime Minister Tony Blair and the Bulgarian emissary Nikolai Mladenov. And then there is the so-called technocratic cabinet of Gaza. How can such a construct work?
Well, putting the names aside, the notion of a technocratic government, the notion of for lack of a better term, a provisional authority on top of that um, uh, technocratic government, I think has as much chance to function as any ad hoc governmental arrangements that are put in former conflict zones. Uh, what I see with the technocratic, the flaw I see is I see the technocratic government coming in. What I don't see is the technocratic government going out. In other words, what does the technocratic government do and have to achieve before they can hand over full sovereignty back to the people of Gaza, if that in fact is the intention of the Board of Peace? If their end state is to move towards getting out and handing over all responsibility and for both running the government, providing the security, getting rid of the security forces inside of Gaza, the international security force, and sort of return to a status quo ante, with the exception of the removal of Hamas. I haven't heard that as the ultimate plan, but in my view, that's what should be the ultimate plan.
From your own personal civil military experience in the former Yugoslavia and Afghanistan and Iraq, what are the lessons learned? What are the do's and don't do's in this regard?
Uh, that's a very good question. I think that we have made the right steps initially. Of course, what we saw in Iraq was come in, topple the regime, but not only topple the regime, dismiss the military and dismiss the governmental structures through a process of de-Baathification. Uh, that didn't turn out so well. There is a certain layer of both the security forces and the administrative functions inside of Gaza that the technocratic government must displace. There's no doubt about it. The corrupt, those that, quote, aren't on board with the new way of doing things. But I think one of the lessons learned, as candidly we're seeing in Venezuela right now, which is to the extent possible, leave what you can in place so that you don't create a vacuum either in security or administratively that has to be filled by outsiders. So that's probably lesson number one. Lesson number two, obviously, is if you can avoid putting your own boots on the ground, avoid putting your own boots on the ground. Number three, you've got to have a little more flexibility in terms of the, for lack of a better term, the ideology that brought you in the sense that one of the ideology that we were pushing against inside of Venezuela was Chavismo. We're not ruling or making a judgment on Chavismo. If Darcy Rodriguez and her governmental structures want to continue to yell at the United States, declare Bolivar rebellion and scream and shout at the moon for their own public consumption, we should be a little tolerant of that and just sort of ignore it. The notion that we would do as we did in Iraq, which was to not only de-Baathify the government, but anybody that's got a picture of Saddam Hussein in their house shouldn't be ever allowed to work inside a government. That doesn't work. So I would say physical presence of troops on the ground is the lesson learned. A little more tolerance in terms of the things that brought you in, particularly ideology, you need to be a little more tolerant in, and that other issue that we talked about, which is what is not only what brought you in, but what's going to push you out, what's going to end your mission. That would be some of the issues that I think one should consider.
Now, in Gaza, up until 2006, early 2006, there was a Fatah mechanism, governmental mechanism,
Yep.
especially since the summer of 2005 when Israel withdrew. Then came the elections in which Hamas won the parliament. Abu Mazen remained and still is the president. And there was a sort of a joint government ran by both Hamas and Fatah. And a year later, Hamas took over. For the last 18 years, everyone is Hamas. That brings about two questions. First of all, can you really separate the managerial echelon from the political, religious, ideological one of Hamas? And then, if you do manage that, how do you get the political support from these leaders now out of power so that the technocrats can operate?
Yeah, number one, I think we forget that small period of time after the elections, when even though Hamas won, Fatah was pretty intolerant about that victory. Fatah started getting a little heavy-handed inside of Gaza, and soon thereafter found themselves being tossed off the roofs. But to answer your question specifically, again, on the managerial class, it takes, again, as I said, it takes a certain amount of tolerance. If you find the, say, the director of electrical services, if you go into their office and they scream and shout at you and they still have a picture of Sinwar on their desk, perhaps you need to be a little bit tolerant. You've got to balance ideology and expertise. Now, when the ideology impairs their ability to exercise their expertise, that's when the person should be considered to be tossed out of the office. If the person is corrupt, they should be tossed out of the office. If they are working with violent Islamic organizations, they ought to be tossed out of the office. But I believe that the impulse should be keeping them in until they prove otherwise, rather than throwing them out until proven otherwise.
3 months on, how do you rate the chances of the International Stability Force being set up?
Uh, the problem with probabilities is there's no such thing as a negative probability. There's just zero probability. So since we can't use negative, I would say it's virtually zero.
Why? Political will or the resistance of Israel to those countries who are willing to contribute contingents?
Well, first of all, I don't necessarily agree that there is a lot of will among some countries, except perhaps Turkey, to actually volunteer forces. Uh, and unfortunately, I think having been responsible for the program called Force Generation for Yugoslavia and Kosovo while I was at NATO, that very arcane process where you put a big chart up on the wall that says these are the positions that we need to be filled by voluntary contributions from this group of countries sitting inside the room. All right, let's start raising our hand who wants to be the assistant chief of staff for supply, and so on and so forth. And that very process of trying to cobble together a force, even if everybody is willing, they soon find out that not everybody is able. So I think that's the major impediment, not necessarily the political or diplomatic vetting done by Israel.
So, General Kimmett, having solved the problem of Gaza in 15 minutes or so, we can turn to the marginal problem of Iran. There have been conflicting.
Well, if we've solved Gaza in our last 15 minutes, I can only imagine how we'll solve Iran as well. But let's give it a try.
Yeah, maybe we will create other problems in the process. Now,
Let's do Greenland.
there, there have been conflicting signals coming out of Washington, especially out of President Trump's own statements. And today, we are seem to be on the de-escalator. Now, whether this is a bluff within a bluff, earlier this week, the signs were towards escalation. Now, at least for a few hours, there is some respite. How can one read the tea leaves?
Well, first of all, these days the process is not the figurative reading of the tea leaves. It's about good, solid intelligence on the ground to find out what the truth is. Yesterday, I listened to a risible interview done between Foreign Minister Arachi and Fox News here in America. And what Arachi was trying to portray to the American audience is that what's happening on the ground is not what is being portrayed in all of the videos that are being sent. Who are you going to believe? Your lying eyes or me? So the first thing we need to do is really have policy at this point today has to be driven by truth on the ground. And right now, the Iranians are doing a pretty good job of preventing us from getting truth on the ground. I had a friend who had an outreach from a member of the Ahmadinejad regime who obviously has been corralled like probably all of his compatriots to send notes to the people that they know, all the people they know, all the journalists they know, to express how quiet things are on the ground. But I fear that we're going to make policy decisions based on incomplete information, which unfortunately doesn't usually end well.
If we go back to last year, the crisis between Trump and Iran started by his warning 60 days before Israel struck Iran that if there are going to be negotiations, they should start by his deadline. The Iranians did not come forward fast enough, and therefore he saw it as his obligation to let Israel strike, and also let it be a lesson that his word must be respected. But at that time, the background was the nuclear project. Right now, during this crisis, which started in late December, December the 28th, it started with the protests within Iran, the violent reaction by the regime, and then the president warning the regime that if they go on massacring people and then executing prisoners, he will act. Lo and behold, yesterday, all of a sudden, the Iranian regime announced that the massacre is over and that they are not going to execute anyone. And the president, Trump, seems to have gone along with this depiction of reality. What's going on here?
Well, first of all, again, part of that risible interview with Rachi yesterday explained away the problem of the 12-day war, which was that while President Trump had offered to talk and Iran was willing to talk, as they were having discussions about future discussions, America attacked. It was perfidy. It was perfidious conduct on the part of Trump. So let's not make that mistake again. But again, I go back to this previous statement I made, which is we don't know what we don't know. And that's why we need to get better intelligence on what's really happening. Obviously, President Trump believes he got good information from a trusted colleague, probably Steve Witkoff, who seems to be pretty well engaged with the Iranians right now. So again, on all of these shows I was on yesterday and other channels, in particular Al Jazeera, there was this notion of de-escalation, stepping back. President was stepping down. Perhaps he was, made afraid. In fact, I said, I don't think it's anything of the sort. He may be holstering his weapon, but that weapon still has ammunition and the weapon is off safe. So I think the president is just waiting for better information as well. I don't believe that there is any determination on the part of President Trump to forestall his plans against Iran. He's just waiting for the evidence to confirm that what happened over the last few days has not, in fact, become a magical ceasefire on the part of the security forces and a embracing of the protesters on the ground. That seems implausible. But as long as there is information coming from a trusted advisor, I think President Trump is saying, there's no hurry. Let's find out truth.
But in any event, the thousands of victims are dead already, even if it stops now.
Sure, but there's a big difference between a punitive revenge operation and a preemptive attack, albeit a bit late, to save future lives.
Now, one, at least in Israel, always goes back to the Moshe Dayan example of 1967. There was a crisis between Israel and Egypt, and the domestic crisis in Jerusalem, with the Eshkol government unable to decide whether to go to war or not. And Moshe Dayan, a former chief of staff, forced himself into the cabinet as Minister of Defense on June the 1st. The next day he was asked about the war, and he said, it is both too late and too early, which was a ruse because 3 days later, Israel preempted, surprised the Egyptians. Could Trump, by those de-escalatory signals, can he try to surprise the Iranians?
And that's what the Iranians are most concerned about, because in their mind, or at least in their public rhetoric, that's exactly what happened in the 12-day war, that President Trump had said, let's talk, let's talk, let's talk. And then while the discussions were about to begin, then he attacked. Could be. I still think that in any case, the very fact that the protesters, if they have calmed down a bit, still does not vindicate the actions that have been taken by the security forces. So if a plan I would recommend to the president, which would be emulate the brilliant operations done by the Mossad and the IDF against Lebanese Hezbollah, where you started a campaign of chopping the head off the snake. When the new head came up, chop that head off, and so on and so forth. There's unmitigated hatred right now for the Iranian Revolutionary Corps. And I think that they, as the heavy hand, the whip hand of the Ayatollah over the past couple of weeks, they deserve to have the same justice brought to them as the violence that they brought to the protesters.
So if I may sum up, because our time is up, you would rather have no current hierarchy without new anarchy.
I don't think we have enough time left in this show for me to calculate that in this pea brain that I have, but it sounds good.
Brigadier General retired Mark Kimmett in Washington, D.C., thank you very much for your wise comments, especially coming out of this pea brain of yours. Amazing. This has been Israel Update on TV7 News out of Jerusalem. We will be back with another update very soon. For the time being, shalom from Jerusalem.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background, 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job, I was the commander of the Israeli Air and Missile Defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.
Jerusalem Studio, now available on Spotify.